Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 271, and we're going to talk about ESport and whether it is an actual sport and how this discussion relates to podcasting or independent journalists versus traditional corporate journalism. Once upon a time, a student came to me uh, before class and said that he wouldn't be able to submit his take-home exam on time because he had team practice for a tournament um, later the week. And so I was like, okay, team practice. And, you got to understand, he was kind of a smallish, Asian, geeky kind of guy. And I just couldn't imagine what sport he was playing. And so I asked him, and he said, oh, his League of Legends team. And if you don't know what League of Legends is, it's a computer game, and it's a cooperative computer game. So you got like 4 or 5 people. I've never played it myself, but like you have a team, and you're all on your own PC, and you play against another team. And I don't know what you're supposed to do. Uh, Maybe kill each other or try to control an area. I have no idea. But anyway, it's a computer game. And so I said, well, let me think about that, right? I went home and started thinking about it because I wanted to be fair, because I told everyone, hey, look, if you're in a sports team and you have practice or you have a game, competition, whatever, just let me know and I'll just excuse you. And I think I must have initially said, sure. But then I'm pretty sure I also said, let me think about it. And I went home and I thought about it. And it just so happened that on Netflix, there was a League of Legends documentary. And so I watched it, just to kind of see what was going on. And I had uh, run into the whole esports thing, but the last time I looked at it, it wasn't this huge. And so I watched the documentary and I was actually kind of surprised at how big it had become. And so I basically, after watching that documentary, have had an answer or came up with an answer to the question, what is sport? And my conclusion was, and my whole deconstruction, redefinition, resetting perspective is to be more inclusive, right? And so rather than say, try to come up with an explanation as to why esport is not a sport, I basically my approach is basically come up with a new definition of sport. And my definition is that if you can get spectators to watch you, it's a sport. Right. And so there's room for everyone in that definition. So there's no reason to hate on anyone, to object, right? I mean, uh, if you want to call yourself a sport, then you can call yourself a sport. So yeah, if you want to call chess a sport, then sure, why not? And that line between a game and a sport, gets blurred very easily. I mean, a lot of people who play baseball or football, they'll say, "Hey, I'm getting paid to play a game," right? So, what makes a game a sport? And people will go on and try to create barriers or create exclusivity by talking about heart rate, sweating, training. Yeah, but it's all very subjective, right? You have a preconceived understanding of what it is, and you force fit everything according to that definition. So you're not actually trying to get a proper sense of what sport is, but you're just basically trying to be bougie, right? You're trying to exclude other people from being able to call themselves an athlete. I know. It makes me chuckle when I say it myself. I grew up playing traditional sports. In college, I played lacrosse, and there was a lot of sort of meathead pride that went along with that, especially since I tried to play. because I never played on a team that was any good. So basically, I played for hits, basically, rather than goals. So anyway, so there was that kind of bougie attitude, like, hey, I play a sport, you don't play a sport. So I get it. But what we're talking about is something bigger, right? To be called a sport enables you now to have travel visas for international competition. And yes, League of Legends, it's an international sport, right? They have competitions where the prizes for the winners are huge, and people recruit players for their teams. And so salaries for players are over $300,000 annually, and that's from a couple of years ago. I mean, several, maybe 5 years ago or something, where I got this story. So I'm sure it's much higher now. So your mom's basement is looking pretty nice now, but it's sort of like basketball, where the number of people who actually play and the actual money-making spots are very, very small. But if you do make it, you make it big. I mean, they have fans, people buy merchandise. It's pretty crazy. Obviously, I don't know a single name, and most people don't know any of these names and probably would never recognize any of the names if they heard it. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a huge following. Just like a lot of esports people would not know any of the names in professional sports. And even now, for myself, I have a hard time keeping up with the latest names. In fact, I know very few names. Like there was that joke. It's like I don't know who Taylor Swift is, but that player sounds really fast, when it comes to football. So anyway, so really what we're dealing with is bougie attitudes or bourgeois type attitudes, exclusionary, perhaps even arrogant attitudes, right? Meathead attitudes. And I realize it's not unlike podcasting or independent journalists and journalism in the traditional sense. I mean, what determined uh, legitimate journalism? You know, was it university training, internships with other people who are so-called journalists? University training these days, from what I hear, is not so much learning how to report the news, but learning how to understand the industry. And it reminded me of how all of us were required to teach students what legitimate resources for papers, academic research papers are versus what are not. And, I looked at these lists and, what are legitimate resources and what are not. In today's terms, you look back at those lists and you realize that there's a lot of misinformation on the legitimate resource list and sort of more a lot of grassroots information, so-called conspiracy theory on the illegitimate list. I remember one time that the government released a list of news sources that are unreliable and full of misinformation, and every single uh, website that I used for my information was on that illegitimate list, that misinformation list. So I thought that was really interesting and made me start to question this whole legitimate research, legitimate resources for research papers kind of training, that it seemed like really what we were doing is trying to legitimize establishment information, legitimize only certain sources, and basically serve as gatekeepers for information. So, university degrees as a requirement for journalism is just a form of gatekeeping. It's like licensing, a barrier to entry, right? And it works as long as employers required it, right? It becomes a standard practice. And as long as all of the industries are using that standard, no one can really see a difference. No one really loses anything. Like you can't even imagine or even want to think about a different way of doing things. But then, of course, eventually it comes time for a new way of doing things. And, the internet and podcasting was the way that revealed how traditional journalism has become corrupt. And of course, who cries the loudest? That would be the people going out of business, right? Traditional news media, newspapers, and such. No one reads it or watches it anymore. And it's not because they're too bougie, right? It's not because they're arrogant. It's because their information is bad, right? Very little of what they say actually turns out to be true. In fact, more and more of what they say, give it more time, eventually is proven to be false. And those people who keep sharing so-called conspiracy theories are proven more accurate, like their information turned out to be more reliable. So you saw this also in the dot-com era, tech startups, right? People realizing that the people who are computer savvy are not necessarily university trained. I talked to people who are in charge of IT, and they said that once the industry sets a standard that you need a college degree, then that's what you have to look for. Otherwise, you look bad to your superiors. But the reality of it is, and I was talking to a guy who recognized himself that the university is old information. It doesn't tell you, it doesn't teach you the current information that you need to be able to do well in a company like Google or Twitter, now known as X. And as long as there's a bubble, people really don't notice, right? And so people who didn't have degrees started being hired by places like Google and Twitter. But then that's when things get exploited and bloated, right? And so when Elon Musk bought Twitter, made it X, he was able to basically slice or get rid of 80% of the payroll. 80, 90% of the payroll, and the company still did fine. And so what we have to realize is that it's not the certification, it's not the so-called accepted standard that matters. What matters is the result and how the customers, the people using or consuming that information or using that platform, they decide what is legitimate and what is not. So Twitter and Google, you could see, were no longer really performing according to their original function. And then Musk bought Twitter and then made it X. And then all of a sudden, a lot of people, more people are using Twitter because that turns out that's the only place that you can actually have some measure of freedom of speech and where bad information is weeded out and revealed much, much quicker than you would normally see in other areas. NASA was challenged by SpaceX, which might not be the best example, but if you're going to compete against a government subsidized program like NASA, I guess you're going to have to be a government subsidized program like SpaceX, right? Um, but you see the idea that the new up and coming competition is able to be better because they're more efficient, right? They are more task focused. And so it's much more efficient, cost effective. And so competition incentivizes people to look for ways to rewrite the rules, to introduce a new product, to do things in a much, much different and new way. And so at one point, you optimized your business by looking for signs of qualification, and the college degree was the clearest and loudest sign. Maybe not so much any longer, which is why promoting family members in your business is not necessarily a sign of corruption, right? Especially like, I mean, this one example, look at a farmer. A farmer makes their children do chores since they were very young, and so they're used to the life. And so even though a child of a farmer might not have a college degree, they would have learned all the information that the family has accumulated over time. And then the college degree just becomes icing on top of that cake, that already delicious cake. And so who decides whether there is corruption or there is not, whether the product is still good or it is not? And that's the consumer, right? In the market, it's the wishes of the consumer, the person who is going to consume the product that you produce. They decide. If you have lots of customers, then of course, then it legitimizes your business, right? Whether it's drugs, whether it's TVs, whether it's food, it doesn't really matter. Whether it's information, it doesn't matter because it's the people who use that information, use that product. If they're satisfied, they're going to keep coming back for more. They're going to tell their friends, which, is the reason why you should like, subscribe, and share this video, right? Whatever. But anyway, everything is pretty much like that, right? Every industry, every job, every field. Doctors versus physicians. I talked about this before. It used to be that physicians went to university to become physicians, and doctors just needed certification. So you could be 13 years old and become a doctor. And when Edward Jenner discovered or basically advertised the vaccination against smallpox, they had to make a negotiation, doctors and physicians. They had to come together, right? Because it elevated the status of a doctor, right? Because doctors, you just needed certification. You can buy that at a much, much cheaper cost than going to college and becoming a physician, right? And so it was a threat to the university system, and so they had to make a deal with all of the doctors. And I've gone into that before. I won't go into it here. So people who are in the established big money positions, right, they object to the upstarts, right? And so they're the ones who complain the loudest, right? The people who are already profiting from the system as it already exists. Then you have this Johnny come lately, you have this upstart, which now is a threat to your business model, to the way you do things. And so at first they complain a lot, right? It's like the five stages of grief. You're going to object, you're going to fight against it. And then there's that negotiation, and then you're going to come to terms with it and just get on with your life. But sometimes there is a big revolution where the previous existing businesses or entities just disappear, right? They go bankrupt. And at this point in time, because of the way inflation is working, the money printing is happening, businesses which should already have been a forgotten memory, they're still hanging around in the form of zombie companies, right? And so right now we're living in this period of time where companies which should have gone bankrupt and people should have already forgotten their name, like Sears, right, is still hanging around, like the JP Morgans and banks like that. And so it'll take a little bit more time, but we already see so many of the cracks, right? And the danger, of course, is always because of so much liquidity, so much money printing that has happened. The danger is that they will co-opt the upstart, right? They will make that upstart part of, the problem. And that's something that we have to continually watch out for. But in the meantime, you will see calls for censorship, regulation, et cetera, et cetera. But this is just basically the process of people who are in that, who have that bougie, arrogant, exclusionary mindset looking down on the upstart. And so, lest we fall into hypocrisy and commit that same esports are not a sport, right? These geeks can't be athletes like I am. I need mental concentration. I need mental fitness and condition and physical conditioning, to be called an athlete. Yeah, yeah, whatever. You can do that meathead kind of, bougie attitude, or you just look at your definition and say, huh, I guess so. You got spectators watching you. I probably many more than are listening to this podcast. And so why do we have to be like that? Rather just reset your perspective. Realize that lots of different things can be included into this category, this racialization, this generalization. The more the merrier. Hey. And in that way, you get to challenge old assumptions. You get to break down previously existing barriers, and you get to sort of reshape society, make society more free in the process. But anyway, a lighthearted topic for this day, and I'll talk to you guys next time.